The permanent five, the G-7, they sound like they could be box office blockbusters alongside Ocean's 11 and the Magnificent Seven. Well, now, coming to an international order near you, it's the D-10. What will the critics say? Flop or fabulous? This is Roundtable. And a warm welcome from me, David Foster. There appears to be a growing sense that the current big boys groups are not so much cooperating as competing. And in times like these, ways of working together might need to be rethought.
In a time of COVID-19, climate change and a rising superpower in China, the world is facing challenges that will define this era of global history. The international order as we know it has been built around alliances between nations, but there are now calls for a shake-up of these clubs of leading countries. There's the G7, containing the likes of Germany, Japan and the United States. The UK's Prime Minister has proposed a D10, adding Australia, India and South Korea to counter reliance on Chinese technology. US President Donald Trump wants a similar group to include Russia. And there's the G20, a bigger club that includes China, Saudi Arabia and Russia, among others. Some analysts are hoping that the pandemic could be the push towards building enhanced international cooperation and what they say would be a new order based on democracy and shared values. But critics believe groups like the D10 could be a return to a Cold War era model, pointing out that global threats need an inclusive global response. So will coronavirus revive multilateralism or divide the world further?
Very pleased to say that we can welcome back Anthony Dworkin, a Senior Policy Fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Also, we can say hello once again to Winnie King in Bristol, Specialist in Chinese International Political Economy at the University of Bristol. Then to Washington, D.C., and we welcome Edward Fishman, non-resident Senior Fellow at the Atlantic Council, previously working at the US Department of State. Great to have you on the programme. I want to come to you, Eddie, first of all, if I may. We need a new order because the old order isn't working. In what way isn't it working?
I think in various ways. What we've seen so far in what is currently the biggest crisis in the international system since 1945, so this is really an epochal crisis we're living through, the international system has ceased to function. The WHO has become a political football, first shilling for China, and then, with the Trump administration sort of, leaving the institution. You have the UN Security Council, which has been entirely missing in action. And even some of these newer institutions like the G20, which played, a really substantial and important role in the 2008 financial crisis, has been completely inert. So, I think it's moments like these, really big crises that reveal whether or not the international system is working. And frankly, right now, what we've seen is just a system that's completely ceasing to function.
Winnie, I'm going to ask you in just a moment whether this is simply an anti-China group. So bear that thought in mind while I go to Anthony and follow up my first point to Eddie. If it isn't working, has it ever really worked?
It certainly has worked better than it's working now. And I think if you look back, you can see basically two phases. There was the period during the Cold War when we had a lot of institutions focused on the Atlantic Alliance, NATO and so on, that worked very well to hold that group together. Then after the end of the Cold War, there was this hope that we could kind of expand that order to create what some people called the New World Order, around the world, bringing the world together in cooperation. And I think what we're seeing now is that that effort didn't work. The organizations that we thought would, bring the world together and allow us to cooperate on these challenges of health, of trade, security, all sorts of things like that. More often than not, as Eddie said, they're turning into forums for competition rather than cooperation. And we see superpower competition being played out across these institutions, leaving them pretty ineffective.
Well, a D10, if it stands for what I think democratic 10 as opposed to the global 7, will it be any different?
Clearly, there are areas now where the common interest of the democratic countries, needs to be emphasized more in the face of a more concerted, competitive challenge from China, from Russia, and from other kind of authoritarian countries around the world. There are also a lot of areas where we still need to find a way of working together with those countries. If you're trying to fight a pandemic, you need not only the democracies, but also the non-democracies to be on board. So we need a kind of two-track approach, coordinating with like-minded countries, but also finding some way of working with those difficult customers out there, like China, like Russia, and so on.
We'll move on to President Trump's idea, which is a D11 in just a moment, including the 10 democratic countries plus Russia. But Winnie, I did promise you a chance to tackle this one. Is this simply an anti-China bloc that Boris Johnson is proposing because he's so worried, as is the rest of the world, about 5G, Huawei tech influences, et cetera,
I think what we need to do is we need to see it in a different light. I think there is potentiality upon which we can see the D10 is trying to say it's an anti-China bloc, but the concerns that the international system has and the multilateral system has right now is the fact that it's not on a united front. And what I think the D10 is trying to go to is go back to the roots of the neoliberal system itself, is finding a basis in the foundation and rebuilding it upon common norms and common values upon which different countries can come together. Now, there's a certain strength in that in terms of the fact that you do have commonality, but there are inherent weaknesses in terms of the fact that democracies are fundamentally different in type and in nature. It ignores the cultural and the historical heritage of different countries, as well as the regional and economic context of supply chains, which comes into play. So commenting as to whether or not it is purely an anti-China line kind of ignores a very large big picture image in terms of why in the world the multilateral system has failed in the first place.
Okay, what does China make of this idea?
China's not been particularly upfront about it. It's hedging its bets, ultimately because what we see out of a D10 is very, very vague. The fact that Boris Johnson has targeted Huawei and tech on the basis of national security is it's a bit of a red herring in terms of the fact that it's a very easy target because it's a basis upon which all of these democracies have been concerned about. But this is not the key weakness of the multilateral system in the first place.
I picked this up from the Global Times, which is a Chinese government-backed newspaper. This is one of the things they had in there. It is another sign that UK decision-making still bows to US pressure. By rallying 10 like-minded countries against China, the plan is largely a Cold War-style design, but today's world can't be dominated by ideology as it was during the Cold War era. So, Eddie, what do you make of the fact that this is, according to the Global Times and other commentators too, simply some powerful democracies ganging up against a very big trade competitor?
So, David, I think this has it exactly wrong. And really, the virtue of the D10 is that it is not purely an anti-China bloc. I think some of the ideas we've seen coming out of the Trump administration, including bringing Russia back into the G7, I think the theory of the case there is let's just bring together anyone, democracy, autocracy, to just try to compete against China. But a foreign policy of negation, David, is doomed to fail. Ultimately, we need to put forward ambitious ideas that people can rally around in democratic societies. And I think the real virtue of the D10 is that you have sufficient harmony in terms of perspectives. You have like-minded countries. Of course, Winnie's right that there are differences, but but pluralism can be welcomed if ultimately sort of the broad themes are aligned. And I think that we have that in the D10. And so I think the virtue of a body like the D10 is there can be new economic compacts. There can be finally democratic responses to things like the Belt and Road Initiative. Doesn't mean it's anti-China. It just puts forward an alternative that, comports with different norms that democratic societies would endorse.
But Anthony, what are the major issues that a D10 would have to face, do you think?
Well, I think it's not a coincidence that these countries, do seem like a kind of a bloc that would contain Chinese influence because, I think a lot of people in the democratic world today see a new situation really where in China we see a rival power with a rival vision of the world, a rival set of values that has a degree of power, of economic weight in the world, that's really kind of very new. And in that sense, it is a big challenge. And I think there are some obvious issues where it's important for the democratic world to kind of collect itself and try and establish and reaffirm the guiding principles that it stands by. This D-10 idea initially in Boris Johnson's telling came out of a sort of an attempt to set standards for cyberspace, for cyber conflict. And clearly that is one vitally important area where I think it does have a role to play. And in the security realm, the question of human rights, international law, the idea of a kind of non-aggression, all of these areas, I think there is a real role for the democratic world to pursue what some people in the United States around would-be President Biden, if he becomes president, will be pursuing a strategy that they're calling a free world strategy. And so, obviously, under current President Trump, that's not the way that the United States has presented itself. So there is that whole range of issues where I think those kinds of standards and a kind of set of values are an important guiding principle. But as I was saying before, I think there also are a set of global challenges where we have to find a way of working with those countries and those powers, China above all, who don't share those values. And that's issues like global health, like trade, because I think we're not going to completely decouple the international globalized economy into two rival blocs, and climate change. All of these issues, I think, have to be tackled on a global level. And so the question is to balance out what are the areas where the important thing is to establish our values, and what are the areas where the important thing is to find a way of working together with countries that don't share our values.
Okay, we'll come back and talk in just a moment about whether this is about self-interest or international cooperation. But Winnie, do you want to come back in?
I think the key thing that we need to think about when we talk about expanding the G7 is that it isn't just about targeting China. Yes, we're definitely talking about containment because they are, regionally speaking, quite significant in terms of targeting China. But there are other security concerns within the region, which in particular North Korea and Russia, which must be taken into account. I think a key thing that needs to be really addressed is the fact that the Americans are remaining to focus on areas and countries which they believe they can continue to have a significant influence and hold over when it comes to prioritizing their foreign policy objectives. Why is it that they're not going towards expanding the UN Security Council, which is something that has been discussed for quite a while? Why is it that they aren't turning towards multilateral institutions and reaffirming them rather than actually exiting things like the WHO, threatening to exit the WTO, calling into question the G20, which actually provides more opportunity for diversification and representation of the world in a more realistic and representative manner?
Well, I would say, or I would suggest, that it is partly because many of these countries have self-interest at heart. They may want global cooperation. Eddie, you may want to come in on this one. They may want global cooperation on certain subjects, but at the end of the day, they're going to pull up the drawbridge if their national interest is threatened.
Absolutely.
That's exactly right. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I mean, Winnie, would you like to go on, or do you want me to?
Well, just really quickly, is I would say absolutely. But I think the key point that we really need to bring to the fore is the fact that the Americans and major European allies are presenting their position in terms of trying to reaffirm an international system based upon their value systems. And they have not yet found a way upon which they are willing to coordinate and cooperate with each other. One of the fundamental reasons why the multilateral system is falling apart is because the Americans are not taking the leadership upon which the international neoliberal system has been built. and therefore by trying to reform it in a manner that deepens American presence and deepens American dominance, but not actually fixing the problems that exist, is one of the key problems that needs to take into account.
Eddie, pick up.
Sure. Well, you see, David, there is a fundamental trade-off in international organizations between breadth and ambition. I mean, it's like anything. If you have more people at a table, it's harder to find common ground on any specific issue. The same is true in international politics. So I think the idea of bringing democratic countries together, it's just a practical solution to a problem. I mean, there's a reason why the UN, which is by far the largest of the international organizations, hasn't achieved as significant results in international politics as smaller bodies like the EU or NATO that have alignment in terms of core values and interests. So I think the D10 is frankly a practical response to a flaw in the current international system, in which there's basically no global institution that is unified in vision and values. We have institutions like the EU, like the G7, that are entirely skewed toward the Euro-Atlantic, and I think that's honestly a vestige of the post-1945 international reality, which was more focused on Europe. What we've seen in the last several decades is a shift in global power and the center of gravity from the Euro-Atlantic to the Asia-Pacific. And this is sort of well documented, David. And I think the only way to actually confront the major challenges that Antony has very well sort of documented in his responses is to create an institution that not only has the Euro-Atlantic democracies, but also the Indo-Pacific democracies. And that's really the rationale for bringing countries like India, like Australia, like South Korea into a body like the D10, because that is the solution to the global problems.
But was that not the case? You talk about Euro-Atlantic countries, but was not that the case with having Japan in the G7 as well? So I'm wondering how different it could be.
Sure, I think it's the difference is you have one right now in the G7. You have one country in the region, Japan. In the D10, you have four. I think it's a significant difference.
And they'll all be given equal status, you reckon?
Yes, I actually think this is another important point. And right now the D10 is just an idea. There hasn't really been much detail fleshed out on structure. My personal view is that the structure should be more collaborative and frankly more flexible. What I mean by that is, it shouldn't require unanimity to make decisions, but at the same time, if a majority of the countries want to go in one direction and a few countries opt out, I think that's fine. We need a vision of international governance that's more flexible because, again, these countries are democracies. In order for them to remain accountable to their body politics, they should be able to opt out of certain decisions, and I think that's fine.
Okay, which leads me, Anthony, since you happen to be based in London, to the role Boris Johnson might have in this and whether, in fact, there will be equal opportunities for every country that is involved in this. Is he trying to Bigfoot it simply because Britain needs to establish its place in the new world after Brexit, or because he thinks that Britain is still a major international power?
I think that's pretty much right. I think this is an initiative that we see being pushed by Boris Johnson because he wants to show that, Britain may be going out of the EU, but it's not going out of the kind of big power league globally. And we heard a lot during the kind of Brexit campaign that this wasn't going to be a sort of little England vision. It was global Britain. And I think this is the kind of idea that they want to continue and push. And there are a lot of reasons, I think, why the UK should still be there. It is, after all, one of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council. It's an important global economy. It has a worldwide reach and a set of networks. So I think the UK does have a role to play. It's going to be a kind of transitional period for the UK. And I think if it sees its global role as being in alignment with the EU, it'll be a lot more successful than if it's trying to set itself up as a kind of, alternative and separate to the EU.
Yeah, I'm just wondering who wants to pick this one up. I mean, since you mentioned the permanent members of the Security Council, and there are moves afoot from various countries to try and put pressure on that to be changed so that it isn't just the 5 who've been there for so many years. Do you think something like the D10 will hasten a change at the top table, perhaps at the United Nations? Anthony,
I
go on.
think-
Winnie, go on, please.
I actually think that what it would do is, if we have something like the D10 that is supposed to be more diverse in its representation, I think it would actually provide an opportunity for the powers on the Security Council, the permanent members, to say, okay, you have this for now. You have some representation, you have some voice. I actually think that you need to just accept that for now. I think it would actually delay any change on the Security Council.
Okay, that's interesting. It's incredibly condescending as well, isn't it?
I agree, and I also think Eddie's point about the fact that we could have something that's a bit more flexible in its model in terms of its representation. Maybe we have some opting out. Actually, we have something like that already, and that's ASEAN. The fact that we have organizations where you cooperate and collaborate, but they are non-binding agreements. Individual countries will decide if it works for them, if it works for their citizenship and for their country and therefore the population, they will then implement it. And ASEAN, just by its very nature, the fact that the organization itself is non-binding in nature when it comes to agreements, has actually undermined its position in terms
that
of
is the Association of Southeast Asian Nations.
Yes, that is correct.
Eddie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think there's in order to actually assess what should happen next, we first need to determine why the international system now is failing. And I think that's something we haven't covered enough, because of course, on the one hand, there is a failure of leadership. To be sure, President Xi Jinping's early sort of covering up of COVID-19 and lack of cooperation on the virus is a huge failure of leadership, as is President Trump's, complete shunning of international cooperation and basically magical thinking at home, pretending that the coronavirus doesn't exist. But I want to get beyond that, because there's also a structural problem. This international system hasn't been working for a long period of time. We could have had this conversation 5 years ago, and we still would have probably all agreed that we need to update the international system. The question we need to ask ourselves is, the best way to do that to take these legacy institutions like the UN Security Council and update them, or is it to create a new institution that actually just reflects the power realities and dynamics of the current international order? My perspective is the latter is much easier. It's very, very challenging to take institutions that have been around for 10, decades, 70 years in some of the cases of these post-1945 institutions, and make them change. It's much easier to create new institutions that are optimally suited to the challenges of today's
Well, I'm wondering, Anthony, we don't have very much time left, but I'm wondering if that would end the competition v cooperation that we tend to see at the moment. Starting again, would that be put to one side?
Well, I think it would be, you'd see quite a lot of cooperation between the members of the D10, not on everything. There are some issues, including cyber issues. If you think of different attitudes towards regulation of big tech, you'd get a very different view out of the United States and out of European countries, for instance. But broadly speaking, it would be a lot easier to get agreement between those big 10 democratic countries. But that is only half the challenge, because there are a lot of influential countries around the world. From a European perspective, not only China, but countries like Russia, like Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, countries that are kind of big influential players, either on a global scale or in the region. And there are a lot of issues which we need to find a way of continuing to work with them. So, I think that the D10 is half the answer. Enhanced cooperation between like-minded countries. But that also has to be a stepping stone to finding a way of living, of working together with these undemocratic countries. We want to have a liberal international system, but there are a lot of illiberal powers out there in the world nowadays, and they're not going away. And so, it has to be a balance where we find a way of kind of muddling along with them, while we also try and stand up for our values as far as we can.
Okay, Winnie, do you think it will happen, or are we going to end up, perhaps as Anthony suggested, with so many different countries wanting to be in so many different clubs that we've got as many groups as we have teams in the English Football League?
I think we're going to end up exactly with something that we have now. Well, basically the D10 is proposing perhaps a shift in terms of the fact that we're moving away from a neoliberal system based on economic reform and development towards a neoliberal system that is based fundamentally upon ideological values and norms. So we're going back to ideology, which is what we saw within the Cold War. And so I think one of the fundamental problems we'll have there is that the key problem that doesn't change is who is the center and where is the center. The center under the D10 and who is the membership remains under the Europeans and the American leadership.
Yes,
and
you see, the problem I see with that, and we're going to have to stop the program now, the problem I see with that is that it will mean somebody, one country, one person perhaps vying to be top dog at that top table. More problems ahead, but listen, thank you all very, very much indeed for taking part in this discussion. It was about multilateralism, but a great deal more. It's about the way the world is run or should be run. Thank you for taking part, and thank you wherever you are for watching this edition of Roundtable. From me, David Foster, and the team that made it all possible. We hope to have your company on another occasion. TRT World Roundtable, that's where we are on YouTube. You'll find hundreds of our programs there if you've got the time during this lockdown world. Join us next time. Until then, goodbye.